I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Christian Nawroth. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Behavioral Physiology at the Research Institute for Farm Animal Biology, and he's an expert in animal cognition and research ethics on animals. Christian, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Adam. I'm happy to be your guest today for the podcast.
Thank you. This is, as I mentioned, a topic I know very little about, so I'm very excited to learn from you. So I know that most of your work focuses on farm animals, and you have some goats in the background, which seems to be an area of expertise of yours. But before this, I saw that you were working with great apes. So maybe we could get started by talking about how you became interested in farm animal research and how you made that transition.
I indeed did my master thesis with great apes. So I was investigating at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, decision-making in all 4 great ape species. This was also one of the first experiences where I got in touch with all the animal cognition research. So primarily I focused on behavioral ecology and animal behavior in general. So this was my first intense contact with animal cognition research, and I really fell in love with the whole research area, and I really thought that I would like to pursue this area further. So when I finished my thesis, I have to admit that I also fell in love with the city Leipzig. So I was very much looking forward to maybe be able to stay in Leipzig and to do a PhD on an animal cognition topic. So I was looking for open PhD positions, and I ended up applying for a position at the agricultural facilities faculty at the University of Halle, which is a sister city 40 kilometers away. I haven't done any work on farm animals prior to that. So this was just like a random shot and see how far I can get. I was invited to the interview. I already realized during my master thesis that there hasn't been a lot of work done using similar paradigms with farm animals. So I was basically suggesting to implement some of these paradigms for farm animals, for pigs, chicken, whatever might be available at the university. And I do not know why, but this proposal was basically accepted. So I got the PhD position, and I was able to run first experiments on pig cognition and at a later stage also on goat cognition. Mm-hmm. So that's how I ended up with farm animals. It was basically, I assume it was pure luck and a lot of happy coincidences and lucky coincidences. But it really helped me to establish a research niche because not a lot of groups and labs are actually working on this area. Mm-hmm. So this was quite beneficial for the animals, hopefully, and for me as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was surprised to see that there's a whole institute dedicated to this farm animal biology, and it sounds like that was already present before you began your PhD. Do you know much about the history of how this institute was created?
I actually do not know the very details, but this institute has been here at this location at the Baltic Sea in Germany since I think the 1920s or 1930s. So it was always dedicated to agricultural research. I think it shifted at some point from plant-based or plant and animal-based research to animal-based research in general. Mm-hmm. And after the reunification of Germany, there was a whole restructuring process, and at this point it ended up focusing primarily on farm animal behavior. So it's not just not on farm animal behavior, but on farm animal biology in general. So it's not just mm-hmm. behavior or animal cognition, it's also genetics, it's also nutrition, it's physiology, mm-hmm. and all things related to this.
Right. So I could imagine 2 very broad categories of this farm animal type research, because you could imagine that one is very human centered. So it's like, how can we study these animals in order to get, I don't know what the goal exactly would be, but, to turn them into food in the most efficient possible way, perhaps, And what's unique about your research is that it seems to be very animal focused. And like, what can we learn about them and how can we treat them better?
Yes, I think this is something that has shifted over the last decades, that broadly speaking, for farm animal biology, that a lot of the focus was on how to make animal production more efficient. And there is still research on this because there is some economic relevance on this topic as well. But in particular, when we are looking at farm animal behavior and not biology in general, there has been a large shift from basically developing or looking at the behavior and see whether animals can at least cope in the husbandry environments that we provide them with, to a shift towards providing the animals with positive welfare, not just with a lack of negative welfare, but with a positive welfare in general. So a lot of focus on farm animal behavior has shifted towards what makes animals happy, what do they need, what needs do they have fulfilled, how do they have to feel to have a good life, basically, in the husbandry settings that we are providing them.
Right. So you mentioned that there's economic incentive for improving productivity, animal productivity, and I would imagine that's from like big food companies. Who's funding the research on animal welfare?
Most of the research that is funded on animal welfare is from public agencies. So there are big science foundations in Germany, the DFG, for example, but there are also smaller societies that in particular deal with farm animal behavior and farm animal welfare. So those are the ones who provide funding for this as well. I have also to know that not, or I think even most of the research that focus on basically improving productivity or production in farm animals is not necessarily funded by the industry, because it's of course there's an economic benefit, but it will these things also I think focus on being competitive in general in animal breeding, in animal production. It does not necessarily have to come from one particular industry or one particular company, for example. So there's a lot of basic research involved in this as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's good to know that this is all covered under basic science, as I was wondering if it was maybe more like private animal activist groups that were funding this type of research. So how dissimilar or similar is it conducting research with farm animals compared to primates or other animals like maybe dogs, for example?
I can't speak for the dog comparison. It was a huge shift from working with primates. Primates were also the first big mammalian species I've worked with, basically, and then shifting to pigs, which were the first farm animal species I've worked with when I started my PhD studies. And I still kind of remember having no idea how, like in the setting that we tested the primates during the master thesis, it was like, okay, the keepers could isolate the subjects. They were already used to being isolated in order that you can test them individually, so no one disturbs them participating in a task. And of course, I wanted to do something, or needed to do something, with the pigs as well. And I mean, just from the whole behavioral repertoire and their ecological background and everything, their anatomy, that you can't just do the very same things that you did with the primates and do that with the pigs. In particular, if you have facilities that do not regularly train the animals to be isolated. So yeah, the very first challenge was find a habituation protocol in order to smoothly being able to isolate a subject from the group without being in distress, and that these subjects then voluntarily participate in the cognitive task that we administered to the subject. So this took really, I think, several months until we find a solution for that, because it was just something at least at this facility nobody has done before. So it was starting from the scratch, basically. Wow. Yeah, it was. I considered it a huge jump. They are both mammals, but it was a huge jump in terms of what is possible, what you have to take care of, what you have to consider when you're starting research with these farm animal species.
Right. It sounds like a very hands-on type of research. Like you were actually interacting with the animals this entire time.
Yes, this was particularly the case for the pigs. And it was quite labor intensive because domestic pigs grow very fast. So during the weeks of habituation that we needed to get them accustomed to interact with a human and to being fine, being isolated, being not stressed with that, they grow really fast, and you need a lot of quite a bit of strength to being able to handle them individually as a single person. So at some point, all of the pigs know that when they are getting isolated, there's food involved and there will be some reward. So everybody wants to join and wants to be on board with that. So you have basically to kind of fight all the other subjects that you've already tested in order to get one of the subjects that you haven't tested that day. So this was really labor intense to my memory.
Did you always envision yourself working with animals and then you later found yourself coming to the biological science side, or was it the other way around? Like you saw yourself doing biological research and then later you decided to work with animals to get that hands-on experience?
There was, I do not remember how old I was, but I think from a very early stage on, I was kind of trying to think about how I can focus on animal behavior in particular. So I started studying biology because I wanted to focus later on animal behavior. I had no idea what exactly to do. At this point, I had no idea how research on animal behavior actually looks like, but I was always fascinated by the topic. So yeah, this was basically the interest came first. And during my studies, I told you, lucky coincidences and so on, I ended up with the farm animals, and I pretty much enjoy being in this academic niche right now.
Yeah, it sounds like a perfect fit. So maybe we could talk about what these experimental paradigms are actually like, because it's not like you can ask the pig how they're feeling. So how are you what are you measuring and how are you doing so?
Of course, this is the big problem when you're working with animals, and when you want to know what they know, when you want to know how they feel, you can't just have a verbal response as you would do this with humans. So you have to have a paradigm that is suited to answer your question. For example, one of the first studies that I did during my PhD thesis or studies was that I wanted to know whether pigs are able to attribute an attentive state or attribute attention to a human, and whether they're able to follow human pointing gestures. These are both subjects that have been heavily investigated with dogs, but also with primates. So just imagine you have two persons, the pig or a subject can choose between two people or two person, and one is paying attention, the other one is not paying attention. In the human example, you would say, okay, whom you're going to ask for directions. You go to the person that's already paying attention because you get this information earlier, faster, and maybe at all in general, while the other person is not paying attention, and there might be a reason they not pay attention to you. So we trained the pigs that they approached these two people, and then one of them paid attention, the other one did not pay attention. And we wanted to see whether they show preference for the attentive person, because the attentive person might be able to deliver the reward faster and at all. And the same goes for the pointing gesture. So what you usually do is that you have 2 or 3 hiding locations where you, out of sight of the subject, hide a little food reward, and then a human points towards the correct location. And what you see with dogs, for example, is that they are extremely good in following these pointing gestures. Yeah, I mean, humans do this automatically as well, and apparently dogs are really good in spontaneously following these gestures as well. What was less known was whether other domestic animals, in particular those who have not been domesticated for companionship or being pets in our households, whether they can use these pointing gestures in a quite sophisticated way as well. So we were testing this with the pigs as well. And this looked basically like that the pigs had to enter through a small corridor, and then they saw a bucket on the left side, a bucket on the right side, and I was pointing either to the left or to the right bucket. And the response going to the left or right bucket was basically their answer to our question, whether they are able to follow this gesture or not.
And did they learn it correctly? Were they following your pointing?
The pigs were actually really, really proficient from the very start. So one of the issues that we encountered at the very beginning was that it took a little bit of time to train them in a way that they have to focus on vision and not on smell or olfaction, because this is what they usually do when they look or forage for food. But once they have realized that they need to look what you're doing, that they have to pay visual attention to what you're doing, they were really, really proficient in using these gestures. And they actually did not had to learn a lot. They were really proficient in using these gestures from the very start, from the very beginning.
Yeah, I've heard that pigs are fairly smart. Do you know how that compares relative to dogs?
They are. I mean, I'm not a fan of comparing the, let's say, phrase it broadly, the intelligence of animals, because every animal species is adapted to the ecological niche they are coming from. So you can't ask a fish to climb a tree, and if it can't climb a tree, it can't be intelligent. So you have to have, you can't really compare often the tasks that you administer to the individuals and compare their performance. But there have been actually some recent studies from a Hungarian team that compared pigs being kept in a household to the performance of dogs being kept in a household in regard to using this pointing gesture, and also in regard to how they interact with humans when they are confronted with a task that they cannot solve themselves, or when they are confronted with a problem they cannot solve themselves. This is another famous example for dog behavior. When you have a dog and you put the toy of the dog away, out of reach of the dog, you will quite often see the dog, when the dog wants to have this toy, looking at the owner, looking at the toy, looking at the owner, like it looks like a plea for help, to please give me this toy. And this is something that this team investigated, and what they found was that there were some similarities in the behavior, but that the dogs were, let's say, more sophisticated and more frequent in their response to this. So also the pigs and the dogs shared the same environment in the household. There were still differences in their behavior directed towards the human.
Is that the same environment basically from birth, or as young as you could get? Or is that you just take two adults, an adult dog and an adult pig, and then put them together?
No, they've, as far as I remember, I think they did not grow up in the same household. They just grow up with humans, and I think they grow up from the very early age on in this human household. So it's not like that they just were transferred in this household, but they were really kept as pets, the dogs and the pigs.
Yeah, that
so
makes
to
sense.
make it as most, or the comparable as possible, because a lot of ontogenetic factors, developmental factors can be at play when it comes to how animals interact and can communicate with humans.
Right. I was wondering how much of this might have to do with that original upbringing. So I guess, the human analogy there would be like nature versus nurture. How much of this is innate differences, and how much is culture in your environment? So you mentioned that pigs primarily rely on smell, and I know that dogs have great noses as well, but is that to say that dogs are more visual compared to pigs?
I think this strongly depends on the context. So pigs are probably quite visual as well when it comes to detecting threats. And when it comes to detecting food, of course, dogs rely also on the olfactory modality, but I think they did in that case also rely on the vision. So they try to, I think this is my impression, combine vision and other modalities. While for the pigs, who, when they forage, often forage for something that is underground, like roots or something that seeds that might be covered with soil, they can't see it anyway. So they have to rely on olfaction and maybe acoustics when it comes to other forms of food that they can exploit.
So beyond being raised around humans and learning during an animal's early development, are there any sort of innate evolved factors? Like, for example, I've heard that humans and dogs co-evolved to cooperate over time, like to hunt together, for example.
Of course, this definitely plays a role. How much that plays a role is not really easy to disentangle, because we do not have a control group of another species, let's say pigs, that have also been domesticated to hunt with humans. And we don't have a control group for the dogs. So a selection line of dogs that has not been selected, that has only been selected for tameness, but not for cooperation with humans. So what we have is we have different breeds of dogs that have to fulfill different purposes for herding dogs, working dogs, and so on. And there appear to be some differences. Also, there is not a plethora on research on this specific topic. And also, you will see a lot of behavioral differences in different breeds of farm animals as well, which probably comes down to some indirect selection or indirect selection of specific traits. When you, for example, quite often when you select animals for production, higher milk yield or higher meat quality or quantity, these animals are often those that have to engage with humans doing milking in the dairy industry and so on. So you want to have animals that are less stressed when they interact with humans, because you don't want to have the animals being hurt because they're stressed and they injure themselves, but you also don't want to have the handlers hurt when they interact with the animals. So there might be also an indirect selection for having tamer or less reactive animals in that. And this probably comes also at play when you have different breeds of farm animals or different breeds of dogs. So
yeah, so the extreme behaviorist view with someone like BF Skinner, for example, with the rats or with the pigeons, the idea is if you train them enough and if you selectively breed them enough, you can achieve almost any outcome. Do you share the same type of behaviorist view? So like, for example, if you did have all the funding and all the time to train pigs and selectively breed them, do you think you could get out of them any sort of behavior that you might observe in dogs or other animals?
I tend to say that we will see a lot of similarities. So just to state one example, we are now working here at our facilities with draft goats. Those have not been selected for production. They are relatively shy. They need a lot of habituation. Also, they have daily human contact. But having worked with dairy goats before, and also dairy goats that have been kept at a sanctuary where they are encountered by plenty of people and unfamiliar people every day, provided food. The goats at the sanctuary, they were basically used to seeing dozens of new humans every day, getting fed by these humans, and they were pretty much acting to some degree like dogs would act in a similar setting. So they were proactively approaching humans. They were trying to engage with the humans. Some of them wanted to be pet by the humans, and this is something that you won't see with the draft goats that we have. So I would agree in a way that if you provide the right circumstances and provide the right context, you will see a lot of similar behavior in domestic animals. I would say, but I would limit this that we will only see it to a certain degree. So there are, I think there are some instances where we won't be able to have a proper comparison for that because there are limitations either in terms of the focus on certain sensory modalities. So it might, for example, always be harder for pigs to focus on visual cues. Visual acuity might also play a role. So there are a lot of limitations that might be at place that will hamper a perfect match when we want to compare the behavior of different species.
Are any of these behaviors unique to humans, like pigs or other animals interacting with humans, or is it just a more general mammalian thing in terms of liking to be pet or having that sort of physical affection? For example, on a farm, you might see animals of different species cuddling.
I think it's again heavily depends on the background and that you will definitely see differences whether animals are domestic or non-domestic. So if you, for example, work with wild goats, you won't have them cuddle with you at any point, I guess, other than being bottle fed from the very early stage and being raised by humans from the very early stage. But at a certain age, you won't be able to habituate them to really behave like pets around you, because they will always be very, very cautious, even if they know you for a long time. And I'd personally say that I do not really think that this is just limited to humans. So if animals are less reactive towards humans, I would assume that they are also less reactive to other species that are around them, and are more inclined to engage with these interspecies interactions as well. That would be my impression.
So here's a related question that might touch on your work on animal cognition. When you have a domesticated animal that at a young age has been habituated to interacting with humans or other species, do you think that they recognize the different species as different and they're just like, I'm okay with them? Or is it more like, because they're surrounded by them at a young age, they think we're all part of the same family?
I do not know right now whether there's any empirical research on that. I know of a lot of anecdotes and short video clips where you see like a sheep behaving like a dog or something like that, because the sheep was bottle fed and grew up with dogs in the household and something like that, or maybe vice versa, that a dog who grew up with sheep is behaving like a sheep a little bit more. I do not know whether these animals are able to actually differentiate that they themselves are a different species. I mean, this all would require anyway a concept of species for these animals, or whether they realize that they are different to their pals that they spend the day with. This again breaks down to how can we actually ask this question? How can we get an animal to give an answer that they consider themselves different than the other animals or similar to the other animals? I think it's not necessarily enough to just see that they show similar behavior, because at some point our human children also try to imitate dogs, and they would not say that they are dogs. They just pretend to be dogs. So we do not really know what goes on in their mind and whether they actually see themselves different or similar. But it's definitely an interesting question, which would definitely warrant further investigation for that.
Yeah, that would be a cool study. I'm sure you've heard of the famous red dot study that was supposed to test self-awareness. So like you draw a red dot on an animal and they look at themselves in the mirror, and whether they notice the dot and like point towards it on themselves is supposed to show whether they can recognize that they're the animal in the mirror. I'm wondering if you had something like that, if you had both the red dot on an animal, on a mirror image of itself, and then also on a mirror image of another species. So like, let's say you're a sheep living with dogs, you would see the red dot on your sheep body, and you would also see a red dot on a dog body that was doing all the same behaviors as you. I guess you would need some sort of like virtual reality in order to get the behaviors to map on completely. So that would be complicated, but that'd be interesting.
Yeah. There's right now a lot of controversial discussion on the extent of animal species that actually pass the mirror task. And in particular, looking at farm animals or domestic animals, there's also some controversial discussion, I think, about recent evidence that I think there was a paper showing that horses pass the mirror task to some degree, and that dogs pass a modified mirror task that would focus more on olfaction rather than visual cues. But these, as far, I'm not an expert on that topic, but as far as what I get on information, these are kind of heavily disputed, whether this is a valid comparison and whether these setups are provide enough evidence to actually make that claim. From my own experience, we have tried this with pigs. So we presented them with a mirror, and we were just curious how they will react, and whether they see another pig or whether they see themselves in the mirror. And at least for the first days when we observed them, until they broke the mirror in their pen, they definitely engaged with this mirror as if it was a different pig. So they wanted to play with the other pig. They showed some play initiation, and they were quite curious to jump they try to jump over the wall to actually see and get closer to the pig, which is apparently behind the wall when they look at the mirror. So this was our personal anecdote on this. This is, I mean, this is again an area of research that has not been really brought into farm animal cognition research right now. So it would be really interesting to see modifications of these tasks being adapted to the different needs and sensory modalities of farm animals, and see the outcomes of this. It would be really a fascinating topic.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. So going back to the pig learning study that you were doing, were there any unexpected findings, or was this more like showing, see, pigs are smarter than we realize?
I'm not sure whether it was unexpected or whether I would consider it unexpected, knowing that even from anecdotes that pigs are considered to be really fast learners. So they are omnivores, so they have to adapt to a lot of new environments very quickly in order to exploit food sources in these environments. So they have to be able to learn really, really fast. I was still surprised how good they were when we are going back to this pointing study, how good they were and how proficient they were at some point, or at least individual pigs at some point, to follow these pointing gestures. I also have to add that there are at least, I think, one or two other studies that were not able to replicate to the same detail the results that we had, which might have to do with different habituation, different human-animal interactions during this time, and so on. But I personally was very surprised to see how proficient they were to following the pointing gesture. And in terms of how quick they adapt and learn to the situations, my favorite anecdote on this was that, as I mentioned, they have to go through a small corridor, and I was basically handling the pigs by myself. So whenever I was not ready for the next trial and the pig was really motivated and wanted to go through the corridor because there was food waiting, I had to chase the pig to the other side again because no, the trial has not started, you have to go back. And only when I kneeled down and were able to administer the pointing gesture, then the pig was actually able to go into the trial and make a decision. And the pigs learned it really, really quickly. So you could really see them looking what I was doing through the corridor, and only and they were really struggling with themselves, like they go a step forward, a step backward, and we're waiting until I kneel down, and then okay, now the trial starts and I go in. This was something we not deliberately taught them to do. It was something that they learned themselves during this whole experiment. And this was, I think, the one thing that even surprised me more, that they were able to inhibit their behavioral response, their motivation to get closer to the food reward, and were able to actually wait until it was their turn. So this was something that personally surprised me a lot to see.
What was the incentive for waiting for them? Was it just that they were already trained on this earlier, so it was kind of, it became habit?
I think the incentive was that they just did not like to be chased out of the arena again, and then just
so if they went in the wrong direction, you would chase them out until they got it right.
If they go in before the trial started, when I was not ready to actually administer the pointing gesture, I had to chase them out, and they didn't get any food, so they had to wait. Otherwise, would have some time delay, and they would not get a reward for a certain amount of time if they would go in again and again and again before I was ready. So it was really cool to see after, I think, just 1 or 2 weeks or something, you were able to see this pattern where they were really struggling and really trying to inhibit their response. This was really, really interesting to observe. Yeah.
So in the next steps of your PhD, were you trying a similar paradigm with goats and other animals?
Kind of. So we did not make a lot of progress during the, let's say, first 1.5 years, because as I mentioned, at these facilities, nobody has worked with pigs in this way. So we had to build some pens and some test arenas, which all took time. So in the meantime, I tried to focus on other farm animals as well. And it happened that I was able to work at a very small sanctuary near my hometown, where they were keeping goats as well. I did not really targeted goats for a specific reason. It was just, oh, there are tame goats. Maybe I can work with goats as well, goats or sheep. And at this point, I figured out that it worked really, really well administering a similar setup with goats. It looked a little bit different. So there was usually a mesh between the experimenter and the subject, and they did not have to go into an arena. But this setup worked really well with the goats, which ultimately led me to move further in the goat direction because it was relatively easy to implement. And the goats learned really quickly how to operate under these conditions.
So it sounds like these tasks were very cognitive, and it seems like some of your more recent work has been looking at animal welfare in the more subjective sense. So like, what are these animals actually feeling, and knowing that, what can we do to improve their well-being?
I would be still a little bit reluctant because it's, with all this animal cognition research, it's really hard to actually disentangle any learned response from, let's say, cognitive response or a more cognitive response, because it's really hard. You probably have, or you quite often have to look at the very first instance, the very first trial, how the animals behave, and that requires quite a large sample size, which is often not given. So it's really, really hard at some point to actually disentangle between learned responses or a mix of learned responses and cognitive features on that. But yes, the plan is, or the idea is in the future in particular, to try to not only do relatively basic research, like being interested in how goats or any other farm animal interacts with humans and how they see humans, how they perceive humans, but also finding ways how we can actually implement this into management systems of the animals. So the aim is to develop more applied settings that would mirror, for example, any management routines for the animals, and then see whether any of this knowledge that we gathered before in this very experimental settings would apply to this as well.
Right. So is this where your work starts to overlap with like animal research ethics? So like, how can we treat these animals better?
I think the applied part overlaps a lot with animal welfare research in general. So how can we improve the lives of the animals that we keep in husbandry settings, and how we can improve the experience in these settings. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, how right now there's a strong shift into how can we provide them with positive experience in these settings. And I think this is where we are also trying to find a stronger overlap with that, because most of the research that we have done so far, it's not something that you can basically go to a farm and say, okay, we know that goats can follow a pointing gesture. We know that pigs can do this. Maybe we find a way how we can implement this right now here at the farm. So we have to think about something that goes into this applied management that you usually have on a farm setting, where these really good learning learning abilities of pigs, for example, or how pigs, goats perceive humans, whether they can anticipate certain behavior from humans, how they've been approached by humans, for example, if the humans are being attentive to the animal or not being attentive, whether their response to this differs. So we are looking for ways how we can actually implement this knowledge into a more farm setting.
There's a quote on your website that I liked that I'd like to read. Farm animals are sentient beings and have sophisticated cognitive capacities to deal with their physical and social environment. We shouldn't treat them with less care than we want to have treated our pet animals.
There's a reason why this quote is on the webpage, and it's I think from an interview 5 or 6 years ago, and I still pretty much agree with all of that. Because this probably goes too deep, but the public perception usually, or what we think others think about farm animals, is that they are, when we would ask people to rate the intelligence or whether their mind functions in a similar way as the human mind functions, most people probably would rate farm animals below companion animals. There are several explanations for that. companion animals are closer to us. Most of us have experience with companion animals. Not a lot of people see pigs in the barn today on a daily basis. So there are a lot of explanations and reasons why there is a gap in this perception. And whether or not there is an actual gap, there might be a gap when it comes to interacting with humans, because companion animals have been selected for companionship, or some of these domestic animals. Whether there is a gap or not, this is something that we have to investigate with empirical research and not rely on the perception of people. The problem is, there wouldn't be a huge problem if people just would perceive animals as less or more intelligent or mind-like as humans, but this usually has consequences in how we treat these animals, or at least what treatment we tolerate for these animals. So quite often we as consumers, we are aware about poor welfare husbandry conditions when we think about animal production in general. There is quite frequent outrage about bad behavior on farm levels where animals are treated really poorly, and still there is certainly a difference in how society would react if this would happen to animals that are closer to us, that we would perceive as more mind-liked or like-minded, like humans, if this would happen to dogs or horses, for example. So there is, when we have this gap, how people would perceive the intelligence of animals, it also often infers that we have a higher toleration level or tolerance level for what we for how we want to treat these animals, or how these animals are treated. So I got a little bit lost in the argument here, but
it's definitely worth diving deep into. So do you think that that the tolerance is actually tolerance, or is it more like ignorance? Like, it's like, if you're not thinking about it, maybe it doesn't bother you, but then the more you learn, the more people are going to naturally gravitate towards thinking that, once they realize that animals are more conscious than they typically realize, for example, that they're deserving of a higher level of care.
I think it's a pretty good mix of different features here. So there might be a higher that we are more able to tolerate certain practices for individuals or for subjects that we do not see as human-like as other species. But as you mentioned, there might be also a lot of ignorance, because as mentioned earlier, we do not see, or not a lot of people have daily interactions with farm animals right now, and in particular farm animals in large production sites. So this is something that we do not really experience firsthand right now, or most of us. So we cannot really relate to their actual experience of these individual animals, which also leads to, just ignoring or subconsciously ignoring the knowledge that we actually have about these facilities, or what might happen at some of these facilities. And of course, there are, I think, again, lots of other psychological mechanisms at play here. We all know that humans are also pretty good in doing excuses for their own behavior. So even if we know how smart animals are, so even if we would be able to prove a point and show that, just as an example, that dogs and pigs show the same performance in a certain task and are equally good in solving a specific task, even if we could show this, that still would not basically lead to a general improvement on how we keep pigs. Because we know that they are kept in an industrial setting, and we tolerate it, we ignore it whenever we can. And even if we have the knowledge, even if people just tell us, hey, pigs are really smart, maybe we shouldn't keep them in a setting like this, a lot of people, a lot of consumers are probably still going to buy the cheaper meat, the less welfare or the poorer welfare meat, for economic reasons, for many reasons, for out of habits and something like that. And humans are just good at making excuses why they did this. It's like for smokers, this is really the last cigarette I'm smoking right now. I'm going to quit right after this, just the very last one, and we are making excuse after excuse for that. So I think it's really hard to shift a mindset because it's just so multifactorial. Our decision making, in particular when it comes to making consumer decisions like buying meat or buying a specific meat.
Right. So here we're getting into a more subjective discussion about ethics. So moving away from the science, but I think it would be still worth having. So it seems like there's sort of these necessary trade-offs that people make, because I'm guessing that most people would say, in an ideal world with infinite resources, we want to treat the animals as good as we can, but then they'll say something like, but if I have to choose humans over animals, then I'm going to do so. So it seems like one argument you might hear, for example, is, as you mentioned, there tends to be an inverse relationship between cost of producing animals for food and their quality of life. So you might say something like, if there's more food and if there are people are starving, maybe it's necessary that animals suffer in order for greater human well-being. I'm not saying I'm arguing for that case. I'm just laying out the argument that you might hear.
I'm not an expert in animal ethics, or I've tried to dig deeper into the literature over some years ago, but it's not right now my focus of research. But I'd say in an ideal world, it might be possible to provide animals, if there are unlimited resources, to provide animals with a good life.
Right.
And then there is, of course, the question whether killing an animal for consumption, killing it painlessly and without the animal being aware of being killed at the moment, whether this would be something that we do not want to have, or whether this would be something that would be ethically okay in some way, because the animal does not actually suffer and does not anticipate any suffering in this event.
Right.
So I think a discussion like this would lead to different discussion and arguments going into a lot of the theories behind animal ethics, and what parts they agree and disagree, and how we treat animals or should treat animals. But I think it's often quite not just simply ethics and mostly psychology, human psychology, how humans behave. We are used to behave in a certain way. We are prone to having habits, and it's really, really hard to break these habits. So when we think about consuming meat, or that we want to change our meat consumption, it's really hard to break the habit of buying a certain brand that we used to buy, or buying a certain amount of meat that we used to buy. So it can often be really hard for people, and that people start to struggle doing this, even though they have the motivation to do this. So it's probably best to try to jump on these psychological mechanisms and trying to help people turning their motivation into actual actions, which might help here as well.
Right. It's interesting that in this example, some people are in favor of killing animals so long as they don't feel pain. So pain is the more important ethical consideration there. But then with humans, you could imagine for the death penalty, even if there was a way to do it without any pain or knowledge whatsoever, but many people would still be opposed to it just for the sake of, you shouldn't kill humans. So that probably points towards something about our psychology as well.
Yeah, I know that there is again a lot of discussion, controversy about this, and this directly points to the human centrism in ethics, and the speciesism that we basically experience in many levels in society. So we apply different ethical rules to humans or than to animals. For valid or invalid reasons, depending on what argument you're focusing on, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are some of the big questions that you're hoping to answer in your future work?
Well, I think one of the biggest struggle we are having, and we realized this doing some of our previous projects, is that it can be really tricky to actually generalize a certain behavior over a whole population. When we would say, let's say we talk about goats in general, goats as a worldwide population, kept in different contexts, kept in different husbandry environments, that it can be really tricky depending on the ontogeny of these individuals, depending on the breed and the genetics of these individuals, to generalize whether a certain treatment has an effect. We saw that when we looked at the behavior of draft goats and dairy goats, and in particular when it came to interacting with humans, they showed striking differences. So it's really hard for us now, when we see an effect of a treatment for draft goats, to actually say, oh, this might apply to dairy goats as well. We need to test dairy goats to see whether there's an effect as well. So one of the struggles we try to overcome in the future is to being able to have a large, or having a lot of subsamples of different populations of goats, to make more proper generalizations about their behavior in different contexts. Because this might, if you want to have an impact on how goats are kept, they are not just kept in industry settings, they're also kept in zoos and as pets and in research facilities. Smaller populations, but they also are kept in research facilities. So we need to know how they behave in these contexts, and whether a certain treatment that might help to improve their welfare, or at least help to decrease poor welfare on farm level, whether this also applies to other settings. So this is something that we're trying to tackle in the next years by testing a lot of, or quite a number of subpopulations with different contexts, and see whether an effect is generalizable.
Yeah, I do neuroscience research, and we're seeing the same problem over the last couple decades with the reproducibility of findings, because over the last 20, 30 years, the median neuroimaging sample size has been around 20, and that produces effects that aren't necessarily replicable. Now we have like these large national, sometimes international studies with thousands of participants, but some of the findings over the last few decades aren't replicating in those larger studies.
I definitely assume something like this for farm animal cognition and farm animal behavior research as well. Yeah. So it's really, I think, really needed to basically combine the efforts of different labs and facilities in order to make progress on this front.
So if we could imagine you had unlimited resources, you could have the sample size you needed, what would be some of the questions that you would really hope to answer?
I really would love to dig deeper into the whole human-animal interactions thing. Like it's one thing to see whether they follow the pointing gesture or not. It's another thing to actually see what exact information they are getting from the human when they are following this pointing gesture. So what do they see? Is it just I go where I see the pointing finger and that's it? Or do they really have an understanding that the human wants to provide information to them? There's a lot of progress on this in dog research. So there are a lot of examples what can be done with other species as well. But it would be, in an ideal world, it would be possible, because it costs a lot of resources, and you often have to have different animals kept in different environments. So they have different rearing backgrounds and so on. But this would be something that I really would love to go further. Another area would be to focus more on reactions of the animals. So what we often did, like for this pointing task, we trained the animals that they have to make a choice. So what do we do with the animals that are just don't motivated to make a choice or reluctant to interact with a human? What do we do with them? Are they just outliers, or do we miss a certain subpopulation of individuals that might perceive the world completely different than the ones that participate in the task? So what would be really cool in the future is also to have more paradigms that focus on the reactions of the animals to environmental stimuli. Because in particular, when you look at farm animals, these are goats, sheep are prey animals. So when they see something that is a potential threat, they do not show any sophisticated behavioral sequence. They most often just stand there and observe what is going on. And getting into this perceptive part, like what exactly do they observe? What is relevant for them? What can they anticipate from the things that they observe right now? That would be something that I would love to tap deeper in the next years as well.
Yeah, I know that in developmental psychology, looking at infant studies, since you can't really communicate with them, there's a lot of eye tracking research. So the idea is that if something is more interesting or unexpected, an infant will stare at it longer. Do you use similar methods for animals to understand what they're interested in or focusing on?
This has been started to being implemented now for primates and dogs as well. So this violation of expectation paradigms have been implemented for primates and dogs, but also the eye tracking procedures. And there seems to be a lot of development in terms of making these suitable for animal studies, because eye tracking is usually done by humans. So you can tell humans sit still and look at the screen. You can't really do this for a chimp or for a dog that has not been trained extensively before. But what you want to do is you want to ideally would like to test a lot of subjects and do not spend months in training these subjects. So there seems to be a lot of progress in improving these procedures and making it suitable for animal species. And what would, of course, be really cool at some point in the future to have eye tracking for goats or any other domestic farm animal. While I see the problem that in most of these species, the eyes are positioned laterally, you have these strange shaped pupils, or eye shapes, which might make it a bit difficult to actually track where they're looking at. But having an approximation of that would already be really, really interesting, an interesting tool to have to play around in the future. In particular, when it comes to what information are they processing, what are they paying attention to? And this would be a really, really nice approach for the future as well, yes.
Yeah, especially if you could combine that type of eye tracking technology with virtual reality, because then you could show them any sort of stimulus you wanted. And also, it's just really funny to imagine a goat wearing virtual reality goggles in a lab setting.
That would be really cool. You know that there is this so-called goat simulator out there. So the game where you can basically play to be a goat and wander and stroll around. I haven't played it myself, but from the videos I saw that they might get the physics, at least how the goat walks, quite correct. So we are also thinking about doing some virtual goat behavior that is more controlled than videos that we would record from actual encounters between goats, and use these as stimuli to present to the goats and see how they react when they see two goats fighting, when they see two goats behaving in a certain way. But this is just something for the future, but that we would really like to implement further here as well.
That's all very exciting. I look forward to seeing what comes out of it. Thank you so much for your time, Christian.
Thanks a lot for having me.